Good morning to my Riverfront family. I hope you're healthy and safe. It's been a long time since we've been together. I miss you and I look forward to the day when we can be together again, maybe even see one another's faces, maybe even sing as loud as we want to, a day where we don't even have to worry about each other's exhaled respiratory particles. Wouldn't that be something? Until then, please accept this sermon as my own message of love and hope for you and for all of us. We certainly need sources of hope and encouragement. We have watched over the past year as so much of our society has come unraveled. The past year has revealed just how vulnerable we are, the vulnerabilities of our systems of government, of our health systems, of our law enforcement and judicial systems. We see ourselves more clearly. We are a people divided. We are racked with racial injustice and inequality. Our economic system allows some to heap up even greater wealth during a pandemic by doing nothing, while some essential workers are forced to eke out a living earning minimum wage, and then some die doing it. And then there's our untenable relationship with our environment as we face the existential threat of climate change and collapsing ecosystems. And our religious institutions have not always been beacons of hope. Often we find that it is religion that is fueling the ideologies that are tearing us apart. So we desperately need a vision of faith that can help speak to the times that we're living in. One that is peaceful, nonviolent, positive, nurturing, a healthy worldview, one that connects instead of divides, one that can put us back into our right minds, one that allows us to see differently, that can bring renewal, a worldview with a healthier and more positive view of God and man, one that changes how we see all our relationships with our fellow humans, but also with our fellow creatures, one that can set us into a more positive relationship with our environment. So now that I have totally overpromised, I would like to introduce you to the Incarnational worldview. It is one that I've been studying and trying to practice for a few years. For me, it's inseparable from the contemplative practice that Liza introduced a few weeks ago. And I love that we are studying this topic as part of an Ancient Pathway series. A friend at work recently said to me, it makes sense that so many Westerners are exploring mindfulness practices in Buddhism since Christianity doesn't really offer a spiritual path. I cringed, but I could also see his point. Much of Christianity is not about the process of searching and asking questions and growth and cultivating receptivity to mystery, but instead it's about possessing the right answers. It's about already having arrived. It's about knowing rather than believing, and more about certitude than about faith. As a result, it's not particularly humble, not very curious, not very gentle, and sometimes not very loving. Well, the contemplative and incarnational worldview is an ancient spiritual path. We find in it the ancient Celtic Christians and in St. Patrick's breastplate prayer. We find it in St. Francis of Assisi and his Canticle of the Sun. And most of all, we find it in the beginning, in the book of Genesis. So in a moment, we'll turn to Genesis chapter 1. But before we do, I'd like to add one quick word about doing the laundry. Early in my preparation for this sermon, my wife, Kathy, told me rather bluntly that she didn't like the word incarnational. I think it was way too seminarian for her, too theological. So I've learned to trust Kathy's intuitions, and maybe some of you will agree with her. So we read Barbara Brown Taylor's book, An Altar in the World. Her expression for incarnation was the spiritual practice of wearing skin. You might like that better. To illustrate, she describes the fully embodied practice of hanging laundry on a sunny day, or the task of carrying water to a thirsty animal, or doing the dishes. All the practices that sustain life, practices in which our doctrines become flesh. It's not intellectual assent, but it is word becoming flesh in our bodies. The spiritual practice of wearing skin is the daily working out of our faith in a human body that is an amalgam of spirit and flesh. So let's start at the beginning and see if we can't make sense of what the business of wearing skin really means. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good. And so the story of creation begins. God's first creation is light, and God declares that the light is good. Then the story continues, but now we know the pattern to watch for. God creates dry ground and says, "It is good." God creates vegetation and says, "It is good." God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars and says, "It is good." God creates the sea creatures and the birds and says, "It is good." Then God creates all the animals on earth, the livestock and the wild animals, and then says, "It is good." So far, God has pronounced a six-fold benediction on everything that God has created. And then in verse 27, God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And one last final time in verse 31, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. Perhaps the first step in this incarnational path is to recognize that all creation is good because it conforms to the goodness of God's nature. God invested God's self into a material world. This creative process is not unlike what many of us have experienced. We have so many remarkable people in this congregation who express their creativity in so many ways. We have musicians and singers who share their talents with us. We have poets and writers and painters and photographers and storytellers who create original forms of art. Then we have chefs and gardeners and tinkerers. And in each case, there is something of the artist that has been incarnated into the art. Ben, for example, I bet that Ben bakes a lot of love into his food. He puts something of his heart into his meals. And I bet that there is that moment when someone is enjoying the food that he has prepared, that he just stands, his hands on his hips, and he thinks, "It is good." Now, I'm not a musician or a poet or a chef, but occasionally I'll tackle a project at home that calls forth my creativity. Let's say a deck. For days or weeks, I will live with the idea of a deck in my mind. I will perseverate over the questions of how it will be built. Will it be strong enough? I'll look over the ground where the deck will stand and I'll anticipate the problems that I might encounter. In time, I'll dig some holes. I'll set some posts and the project begins. And while I'm not a professional, usually at the end of the process, I can stand back with my hands on my hips and look at my work and say to myself, "It is good." Now, what that means is that the end result matches more or less the version of the deck which had come alive in my mind. The deck in its beauty and functionality had become an incarnation of all the invisible processes that had occurred inside of me. So there's three ideas I'd like to extract from our humble experiences of creativity and put them alongside the Genesis 1 creation account. Number one, in the heart and mind of the artist, there is a pre-existing idea. This template or blueprint might correspond to that great philosophical idea of logos that John includes in the opening chapter of his gospel. Number two, there is a creative process in which the idea becomes incarnate, or as John puts it, the word becomes flesh. And number three, there is delight over the goodness of the art when it reveals the will and the heart and the nature of the artist. Richard Rohr, in his book, The Universal Christ, applies the idea of the Christ to include the divine nature that God has invested in all creative things, which is, of course, far beyond how we're accustomed to thinking about the Christ. Traditionally, we have narrowly applied incarnation to Jesus as the unique incarnate Son of God. But this incarnational reading of Scripture sees God's pre-existing plan, the Logos that became flesh, as the template not solely for Jesus, but of the outpouring of God's self into the material world. The Logos is God's passionate desire to make a marriage of spirit and flesh. So Rohr concludes that to be a Christian is to be someone who is learning to see Christ everywhere. All created things, everywhere you look, under every rock, every blade of grass, every tree, all the animals in the forests, all the sea creatures, great and small, all have a portion of the divine nature. The spiritual practice of wearing skin is encountering the divine in every moment of your life. It is the experience of living in an enchanted universe, crackling with possibilities. This is not pantheism, which is everything is God, but it's panentheism, which is God is in everything. Everyone, everywhere, everything, every place bears the divine stamp of divine DNA. So on the fifth day of creation, Genesis 1:20 through 23, God seems to realize that she's onto something special. This is the day that God creates the sea creatures and the birds. And for the first time, God pronounces a blessing on what she has made. And she says to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Maybe it's the wild plumage on all those tropical birds. Maybe it was the colorful coral and the radiant sea anemone, but something about these creatures seems to awaken a special tenderness in the heart of God. Maybe what God is saying to the birds and the sea creatures is, here, I give you existence. I give you a share of my nature. I invest myself into your very flesh. Now take this existence and see what you can do with it. It becomes a chance for all living creatures to be co-creators with God, to grow, to change, to adapt, and even evolve and allow the creative process to continue to unfold. So maybe the second step on the incarnational path is to learn to take delight in creation as God does. There's a documentary that I just watched that's entitled My Octopus Teacher. It's about filmmaker Craig Foster, who finds himself in a dark place, burned out and depressed. And he decided to put his career on hold and to reconnect with his own roots by returning to South Africa. There he begins swimming daily in a kelp forest in a bay along the coast of his hometown. During this time, he meets an octopus who is shy and hides inside of her den, but he thinks to himself, what if I visited this octopus every day? And for a year, he keeps returning. Slowly, the life of the octopus, as well as that of the creatures large and small, all the teeming life in that one little bay, begins to unfold for Craig and for us as we watch the film. It's a world of color and light and movement and struggle. Mostly we come to know this octopus, this mollusk without a shell, this liquid creature. She's curious and adaptive, but also brilliantly intelligent. She's playful, but also surprisingly intimate as she learns to trust Craig and to enjoy his visits. It's amazing to watch their relationship unfold. And I couldn't help but think that it was the divine nature embedded in one creature that recognized something of the divine in the other. So perhaps the next step in this incarnational path is that by paying attention to the divine that is hidden everywhere around us, we learn to experience reverence. According to Barbara Taylor Brown, reverence is the recognition of something that's greater than ourselves, something that is beyond human creation or control, that transcends full human understanding. Then she goes on to describe a Native American elder who teaches people reverence by steering them over to the nearest tree. Do you know that you didn't make this tree? He asked them. If they say yes, then he knows that they're on their way. So as Craig Foster paid attention to this one octopus, as this octopus became his teacher, and as his reference for both the octopus and her world increased, it might not be surprising that Craig himself was changing. It was as though this relationship that Craig found, it was through this relationship that Craig found that his pain and darkness and depression in his life was lifting, that he found renewed purpose and energy, that his relationships with his wife and son were improving. It's not an overstatement to say that it was through a relationship with an octopus that Craig was learning something about being human. So now on this incarnational path, we can say with confidence that not only is creation God's first incarnation, but it's also God's first self-revelation. Psalms 19 says, I love it, it's so beautiful. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. And Paul says the same thing in Romans 1:20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. Creation is God's first revelation, God's first self-disclosure. As the Franciscans put it, creation is the first Bible, which was written many billions of years before the second Bible was written. And we would all do well to read it as intently as Craig Foster has learned to read it. What Craig is doing, whether he knows it or not, as he learns and enters into a relationship with an octopus, is opening his heart. He is opening his heart to the great text of God's revelation. And so it's no wonder he's found great depths of wisdom, peace, and healing. So I want to commend this incarnational path as a solid and healthy foundation for living and a needed corrective to some of the very unhealthy and toxic theology that we have known all of our lives. Now, there are two creation stories in Genesis. I've only emphasized the one found in Genesis chapter 1. But the other, which is in chapter 3, is centered on the fall of man and frames the narrative for the rest of Genesis and really for the rest of the Bible. For the rest of the Bible, God must decide how to work with sinful humankind. And I don't want to minimize the reality of sin. We do, after all, see the ravages of sin every day, everywhere around us. We see the profound and heartbreaking effects of man's inhumanity to both others and to the entire creation. But too much Christian theology has been dominated by the fall of man and original sin. It's almost as if the Bible begins in chapter 3 with an original curse instead of chapter 1, which is the original blessing. So much bad theology and bad anthropology. Some really low views of human beings are derived from chapter 3. Like the Puritan Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where God is a malevolent torturer and human beings are either worms or spiders that are being dangled over a flame. We must not allow the original blessing of chapter 1 to be subsumed by the original curse of chapter 3. This incarnational worldview that I'm talking about is rooted in original blessing. Our faith is grounded in it is good, it is good, it is very good. The truest truth of our lives is not separation and division. It's not disunity and it's not sin. We are each so much more than our worst sin. What is really real is the union and the oneness of all things. It is connectedness and joy. It is the relentless flow of love of which we are a part that begins in God and will ultimately return to God. And I must add that this wholesome, healthy, and positive view of God and man must also have been Jesus's own perspective. Jesus sees the good in every person. whether Roman, Greek, Jew, or Samaritan, whether male or female, rich or poor, whether tax collector, fisherman, prostitute, or thief on the cross. And Jesus also sees the divine in the flowers of the field, of the sparrows when they fall to earth, in the salt, in the light, in the leaven, and every other material thing. To Jesus, all these are the hiding places of God, and all are places of revelation for God to be found. So my last word on this incarnational journey is the full sacramentalization of life. A sacrament is the means by which we experience grace. Traditionally, it's ritual acts like baptism and communion. And yet this path we've been studying this morning means that just waking up and putting on your slippers might become a moment of communion with God for you. Moses experienced God in the wilderness when he stopped to look at the burning bush. Jacob laid his head on a stone and dreamed of a ladder where angels were ascending and descending from heaven. We see these stories as extraordinary moments. But the real point of these stories is that for those who are ready to perceive them, every bush is a burning bush, and every stone is the gateway to heaven. A few days ago, it was evening and bitterly cold. I was taking the dogs for a walk. I was consumed with all my inner thoughts and anxieties. My eyes were cast down to the ground when something caught the edges of my awareness. It was a noise. Slowly, my gaze shifted from my feet up to the skies. It was a ragged grouping of Canada geese reforming themselves into a V formation. They were honking and calling out, encouraging one another, then another larger V formation, and then another, all flying into the cold, all flying into the setting sun. And I smiled. All my emotions shifted. I remember God's delight on the fifth day of creation. I remember that on that day, she blessed the Canada geese. God said, here is a portion of my very nature. Now go and see what you can do with it. And in that moment, I knew that God was still saying, it is good, it is good, it is very good. May God bless each of you to experience God's grace in this precious body of ours, this body that she has given you, and that you might experience every moment as a sacramental moment of each day. Amen.